Welcome to week 5, everyone. Great to have you here in kind of halfway point of the course practically. And I'm pretty enthusiastic about what I see you all gaining in the discussion forums. I think we've had some great conversation again this past week, even as we've navigated some thorny questions together and some persistent ambiguities, I think, as we try to make theological, practical sense of what Paul is teaching. This week, week 5, we really are facing a formidable challenge in the first passage that we have, 5:12 to 21. Formidable because Paul is arguably convoluted in these paragraphs. He begins sentences that he doesn't end. He appears to introduce related thoughts, but not waiting until he's completed the previous thought to do that. So there are a lot of things that can really throw us off in this passage. And of course, I've tried to help a little bit with my translation as well as the podcast exposition for this week, but I have no doubt that that will still leave many of you frustrated, puzzled. So you're not alone. It's a very challenging passage to navigate. And as much as I hope to have shed some light on it, I expect you'll have many questions. And so please do hear my invitation to continue what you have been doing, which is to bring those questions into your responses. They don't have to kind of wait in the margins or wait for later. Those questions are legitimate modes of responding to the prompts in both forums, and especially in forum 2 for this week. So looking forward to the discussion. Just as a reminder, if you joined a video conference group, that is going to replace the requirement of posting to response forum 2 for the week, as well as the requirement for any written interaction with other members of your group. And that's because in our video conference discussion, you'll have the opportunity to respond live verbally to the prompt for response forum 2, as well as interact with one another. Do remember that going forward, you're going to need to do this each week to join your discussion group for the week, whether you're going to participate in a video conference group or not. You won't be able to access the forums to be able to respond to them until you have joined a group. So do try to join your group as soon as possible. It helps me if it can be done by Wednesday, because then I kind of have an idea of what to expect in the video conferences and that sort of thing. Also want to remind you that next week, week 6, will be the week in which you'll be submitting a draft of your interpretive working paper. And I hope that you have chosen the passage that you're going to study. The options are in the syllabus, and that you have begun thinking about how you're going to approach the investigation and analysis of your passage for that interpretive working paper. I first want to say about that assignment that it is to be distinguished from the advanced interpretive paper, which will be the last formal assignment that you'll have in the class, due at the very end of the term. It's distinct because this working paper is more investigative. It is more concerned with asking questions of the text and probing the text interpretively in light of those questions, interacting with commentators and other secondary writers. It's not a paper yet where you have a sustained argument in defense of a single interpretation of the passage as a coherent kind of stage in the argument of Romans. That's what you're going to be presenting in your advanced interpretive paper. So be sure to take advantage of this working phase of studying your passage, where you have an opportunity to investigate possible lines of interpretation, often multiple lines of interpretation of the same part of the passage or the same question about the passage as a whole. and that you don't need to resolve those multiple lines of investigation at this point. You'll need to be able to arrive at some conclusions and make an argument in your advanced paper, but not in this interpretive working paper. I find that often students want to jump over this working phase and produce in their first assignment what is already essentially an advanced paper with a full-fledged argument for the interpretation of their passage. And the way that that hurts a student is often it just hasn't given them the opportunity to tease out some possibilities first and to play with some different ideas, even competing ideas in the working phase that will then enrich the argument that emerges for the advanced phase of interpretation of your passage. This paper, the interpretive working paper, does mean to now invite you to display the skills that the class has sought to inculcate in you to this point. Skills like your ability to situate your passage in the flow of the argument of Romans, instead of treating the passage or any part of it as a kind of independent fragment. So your interpretation, your analysis, your questions, the multiple lines of interpretation you tentatively begin to draw out, those should reflect your sense of how your passage comes in the flow of Paul's argument. What has given rise to it? What is at stake in your passage, in the argument, etc. A key related skill is your ability to identify and track with the rhetorical purpose of the passage in the stage of the letter in which it sits. That is what Paul is driving at, what his aim is pastorally, conceptually at that stage in the argument, and not to allow your interpretation to kind of lose that tension and begin to comment very generally on the meaning of terms or the meaning of key doctrines that we associate with the language of the passage, but are really not what Paul's rhetorical concern evidently is. So you want to display in your working paper, your analysis, an ability to kind of wrestle with what Paul's rhetorical purpose is in your passage as a whole, and in particular parts of it as it develops. And then finally, another skill that I think is worth highlighting here that your work should display is your awareness of any shifts, significant developments in the argument that are present in your passage and that require your attention if they're going to be interpreted well. An example of this would be what we worked on this past week in week 4 on Paul's striking sort of encouragement of the audience to boast after he spent several chapters telling them that boasting has been ruled out. And so to make sense of what sort of boasting Paul is encouraging and why he's encouraging it, one has to observe that that's a shift in the argument and clarify how the boasting that Paul is encouraging in chapter 5 is in contrast and even subversive of the boasting that he has been discouraging in the preceding sections of the argument. So your interpretation needs to display a sense of how the argument is developing in terms of shifts that your passage exhibits. So I hope those are just some helpful guides for what you want to be thinking about as you try to put together your first crack in an investigation of the passage. There is obviously an assignment guide that I hope you will print out probably and just have sitting next to your computer or your pad as you're working on your paper. You don't want to lose sight of what the assignment is actually asking of you. And then, of course, there are some example papers as well written by students in the past that I think have fulfilled this assignment well and that I commend to you as models. So some work coming up next week for that. Hope that you will find that the class has prepared you well to do this assignment, and that by the end of the class, that the class has effectively empowered you to engage interpretively the letter of Romans in a fruitful way. As I said at the beginning, we have a very challenging passage to open up our study this week in 5:12 to 21. It is epic in scope. It is full of puzzling turns, distinctions, etc. And I look forward to trying to thread through some of those with you, whether it's live in a video conference or as we've been doing up until now in the asynchronous forums. Hope you all have a great week this week 5.